feared and feared through Killarney. Now I'm back to hitching with the wind. But if Mickey Flynn should ever find me, I'll throw me caution all behind me and square off on that son of a bitch again. He cracked open a river too, he beat me Sunday through and through, and so jiggle my unconscious frame. I won me healthy sheriff fights, well lucky son still had me life since Mickey Flynn beat me dumb and lame.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Disciples of Ed. Here I am your host, Rob, joined by Bork. How you doing, Bork?
Doing great. It's always great to talk some Flyers hockey, especially after we were able to get in a good Phillies podcast there for Chasing the Pen, and check that out for our baseball fans. But it's always great to talk some Flyers hockey with everyone here.
Absolutely. And we're also joined by a special guest tonight, my good buddy Nick Gallagher. How you doing, Nick?
Rob, thanks for having me, guys. Both of you, really appreciate it. I'm doing well. And after a big layoff, it's, again, like John was saying, it's great to talk some Flyers hockey again.
Absolutely. And Nick, you are a member of your own podcast. Why don't you tell us where we can find your podcast, both on social media and the streaming devices that we can find it on?
Yeah, so 215 Unfiltered Network, UnPhiltered, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Twitter, we just reached 1,000 followers, so go join the party over there on Twitter. We're tweeting constantly every day with daily sports and the daily news. Facebook, we're about at 48 likes is the last I saw it, so help us get to 50. And we're everywhere podcasts can be found as well, as Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, etc. So everywhere you get your podcasts, check us out. Everything Philly sports and everything in between too, guys. I think I want to say a little special shout out to that too, because we don't just talk sports. We talk about a lot of life issues and throwback stuff that we talked about and grow up with. So check out if you like any kind of that stuff in between.
Yeah, some really good stuff over there. You guys have put out a lot of quality content. I've been listening to all the stuff that you put out. So definitely, if you're listening to this, go check them out as well. They're definitely worth a listen. Yeah, Nick, thank you for being able to join us tonight. We had a little bit of technical difficulties early on before we were able to get going here. But thank you for sticking with us, and we're ready to get underway here. Since the last episode that we recorded last week, unfortunately, the Flyers had dropped both games. They had a shootout loss to the New York Rangers, and then they had an absolute shit show out of Tahoe against the Boston Bruins. And we'll start off with that Rangers game. Well, for both games, actually, the Flyers significantly shorthanded due to their COVID situation, missing a bunch of guys, missing Voracek, missing Giroux, missing Lindy, TK, you name it, a whole bunch of guys out of the lineup due to their COVID situation and positive tests, unfortunately, which meant they were out for the entire 2 weeks that was required. They missed them. I mean, they had some guys who stepped in and played fairly well and were able to help them get the point in that Ranger game. Farabee with the tying goal late, sending it to overtime, and they ended up losing in a shootout. But unfortunately, just their lack of depth, with all the guys missing, it came back to bite them, losing to a team that normally they would beat in the Rangers, and then just getting their asses handed to them up in Boston. Guys, let's take a look at that Rangers game, though, real quick. They took an early lead. The Rangers came back, tied it, I believe, in the second period, took a lead late in the game, and then Farabee with the tying goal towards the end of the regulation. Had some chances in overtime, were not able to capitalize. Georgiev had a pretty solid game between the pipes for the Rangers. Carter Hart played pretty well for the Flyers, but in the shootout, really kind of looked non-competitive, I guess is the best word, in the shootout attempts. And the Flyers just doing what the Flyers normally do in a shootout, which is lose. What's your Bork, we'll start with you. What was your takeaway from that game?
That game, I was just happy we got 1 point, because honestly, when you're down that many guys, it doesn't matter that you're playing the Rangers. They still have skill on their team. It's just they're not showing up yet for two guys in Kakko and Laffy, and then yet in terms of figuring it out again in Zibanejad, who hasn't even been close to what he was in last year to this point. But they have guys that do produce. Usually Kreider is a Flyers killer, and he actually, Blackwell and guys that wouldn't normally bang them in were actually the guys that ended up hurting you in that game. Brendan Smith of all freaking people scored. So you had guys that normally wouldn't pot it, which is typically what happens against us. Guys that don't normally score somehow become Mr. Clutch. But
unless it's David Pastrnak we're talking about.
Yeah, unless it was David Pastrnak, and then he would break records if he played us every game and be the best goal scorer in the history of the freaking NHL. But I think the team is going to honestly be fine, just because the word I used earlier is perseverance, where you were able to get a point in that game where you looked bad at times, and then you came out really good in the third, and you had a good final period with a partial AHL roster because of guys that were out. I do think the weirdest thing that did happen, like I said to Rob before the podcast, was I thought Kasha played all right and then got subbed out when he's more ready for the NHL than some of the guys we left in, or we put two defensemen at forward, one guy that didn't play forward since he was 9 years old in Mark Friedman. So, like, I feel like there was some really nonsensical thinking when it came to the Tahoe lineup. But for this particular game, I thought we put out a pretty decent lineup. And it actually showed where, honestly, I think Morin at this point should move back to defense. He just doesn't look like a forward to me, where Friedman outplayed Morin as a forward in one freaking game and actually looked better on the forecheck when he hasn't played since he was 9. So I feel like that should be ringing alarm bells and the staff going, yeah, we should just move this guy back to defense. But getting 1 point, I think, was a big thing, and you were able to have guys that you want to have look good, look solid on the ice, like the Fairbys of the world. Knack stepped up and actually looked like he can be that Swiss Army knife that everyone, including me, has always said he is, and move up in the lineup when needed and kind of change his role to being more offensive and not as brute like he changed his role to be in the fourth line. So I think it's nice to see that, but I was just happy we got 1 point in that outcome, because Capo Kakko and Artemi Panarin are just gods in the shootout. And Kakko's first 4 attempts, he's 3 for 4 and has made every goalie look like a dumbass in all 3 of his goals. And then Artemi Panarin, good luck to you, by the way, Artemi, makes everybody look like a freaking moron when he's in a shootout. So he's one of the best shootout guys in the league. So I mean, Dominic Hasek probably ain't stopping Panarin on.
Yeah. And let's be honest, Carter Hart has not been excellent in shootouts throughout the course of his career either. He's done a lot of things very well. Having a rough year this year, but shootouts have not been a strong suit for him. And letting in both attempts that he faced against the Rangers, certainly not trending in the right direction there. Yeah, I'm with you, though. I do agree that considering the roster situation, it was a success to just get a point there. Farabee with the big goal with 1:14 left to send that thing to overtime and get that extra point. But just the lack of depth came back to bite them. And once again, special teams failed them. They failed to score on the power play. They let up a power play goal to the Rangers. That's been a recurring issue, not being able to kill off penalties this year. And it's unfortunate that they had that long time off, and they came back and they still didn't have all their guys. If they had come back from 2 weeks off, 2 weeks off and had most of their guys back, I think it would have been a different story, because you would have had all these talented players with fresh legs. Unfortunately, they had the fresh legs, but they didn't have the guys that they needed in the lineup. And when you're missing that many players, even a lesser team like the Rangers is going to have an advantage there. So, yeah, I do consider it a success that they're able to get a point out of that game. Nick, what was your takeaway from that first game against the Rangers?
Well, Rob, I mean, John hit on so many good points there. I mean, obviously, just to get it to overtime alone with Farabee, and I was watching that with bated breath, and then when he was able to put that in the back of the net to send it to overtime, I'm just one of those guys, when you get a late goal, it should carry into overtime. It's the momentum. It's just how hockey works, and the Flyers have just not been that kind of team historically over the years, getting a late goal and it carries into overtime. But you really thought they played slow a little bit at overtime. I don't know if it was just tired legs or who was out there, and the line combinations for overtime with these kind of guys, and you only having 3 guys out there. So, I mean, they played all right. Again, I guess you got to be happy where you can get a point. I mean, of course, again, they got outshot, but again, you got to look who was dressing for them that night, too. Carter, just another victim of, I guess, bad defense and also just not really doing well in shootouts overall, which is, again, as Robbie, you just mentioned, it's not really a strong suit of his over the last couple of years. And he should get better at that, hopefully, and that's something you got to work on. But I guess you got to be happy. It was the first game back from COVID. I didn't even expect much, but I mean, a point's a point. But they could have actually stolen this game and won this in overtime, I think.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. They got the 1 point. I think that they should have been able to get the second. And you're right, they did slow things down in overtime. However, they still had some pretty good scoring chances. And Georgiev for the Rangers was up to the task, unfortunately. And yeah, just once again being non-competitive. Couturier was able to capitalize on his shootout opportunity, but Kevin Hayes didn't even come close to scoring. JVR didn't even come close to scoring. Carter Hart didn't even come close to making a save. It's just more of the same shit for the Flyers and shootouts. So that's how that ended, a shootout loss to the Rangers in their first game back from the COVID break. And as bad as that was to watch, it got a lot worse on Sunday out of Tahoe. A game that looked promising for a little bit. You know, they took a 2-1 lead early on, and it was just an absolute shit show after that. Giving up 5 consecutive goals, falling into a 6-2 hole, and then trading goals at the end for a 7-3 final. A fourth loss at the hands of the Boston Bruins, who have beaten them twice in overtime. Excuse me, a fifth loss. Beaten them twice in overtime and have beaten them 3 times now in regulation. Boston continuing to have the Flyers number, albeit this time a shorthanded Flyers team, but just still a very underwhelming effort. Really disappointed to see that they didn't have a little bit more juice, especially after taking that lead on the Couturier goal in the first period. They gave it back, 35 seconds later or something like that. Of course, Pasternak, his second hat trick of the season against the Flyers. Of course, Marchand and Bergeron also found their way onto the score sheet. I can't remember the last time Marchand played against the Flyers and didn't have a point. It feels like it was probably like 10 years ago at this point. But yes, they were shorthanded, but it was still just a really disappointing effort. And Carter Hart, you know, you can blame the defense as much as you want. He was bad. He was just, there's no other way to put it. He was bad on Sunday. He's letting up goals where he's not screened, which is something that's really uncharacteristic of him. Normally, when he has a clear view of the puck, he's able to cut down that angle properly. He's letting up goals where he's not screened, but he's not cutting down the angle, and the shooters are just able to pick corners on him, and that happened a few times on Sunday. And so the struggles for him continued. Maybe the sun was an issue. I think the sun was an issue for Tuukka Rask on the first goal that came caroming off the boards, and Farabee was able to get that. So maybe the sun was an issue for Hart on Sunday as well, but just a really uninspired effort for the whole entire team, and that includes Carter Hart. Nick, what's your takeaway from Sunday's game? Do you think it was just an uninspired effort, or do you think that they were just overwhelmed by their lack of depth?
It's got to be, Rob, their over lack of depth, because they came out and you're leaving the first period tied at 2 apiece, and you're like, okay, you're going in the second and you have a chance. You're going toe to toe with Boston in a nice outdoor game, so you think they were gonna stand up to the challenge and at least go toe to toe as far as they could in this game. And then the second period, Rob, I mean, it just fell apart little by little. The strings just kept falling down, and this team just fell apart defensively. And like you said, I think Carter Hart and the Sun, it had to be somewhat an issue, at least on 2 out of the 4 goals in the second period had to be an issue. And I know he wants them back, and I feel like maybe he would make a save in an arena setting, but they just, after, I don't know what happened. You come out of the locker room and they just didn't seem the same in the second period, and Boston kind of just put their foot on the gas, stepped on the Flyers' throat, and just didn't look back. I mean, they just played completely aggressively, and Boston controlled the puck in their own zone a lot. The Flyers were skating and chasing, and that's something you can't do, and you have to avoid that when you're playing a team like Boston who's going to make you play their game. And, I mean, yeah, you could say it was outmatched, but Boston played their game and made the Flyers chase all night, and that's kind of where they lost the game.
Yeah, that's really been the situation each of the 5 times that they've played each other so far. And once again, Boston with those quick strikes that kind of put the game away. We've seen that happen a few times where they score once and then they score again a few seconds later. And what we had on Sunday was a 3-2 game late in the second period, and then Boston struck 3 times in the course of about a minute and a half to blow the doors off of it, turn it from a close 3-2 game into a 6-2 game, and essentially the game was over at that point. It's happened numerous occasions. I think that's probably like the 3rd time this year where Boston has put together at least 2 goals in the span of a minute. And we saw it last time they played down in Philly where the Flyers had a 1-0 lead, and then the Bruins struck twice, I think, in 27 seconds and ended up winning that game. We saw it the first time they played up in Boston where the Flyers had a multi-goal lead, and Boston tallied, I think it was 2 goals in the span of a little more than a minute to tie that one up, and they eventually won that in a shootout. So that's been an issue as well, is giving up those quick goals against the Bruins. Boric, what's your takeaway? Do you think the Flyers just don't match up well against Boston regardless of who they have in the lineup? Or do you think, once again, they're just doomed in by their lack of depth on Sunday?
Well, I think Sunday it was exactly what Nick said, a lack of depth. And I also agree with what Nick said where I didn't really think of it until JJ brought up when I was on the podcast with Steel Flyers earlier, which was depth perception. When you're outside and you have the sun, not just the sun, but the fact that you have no depth perception, you're literally looking at mountains in the background, and you don't have anything that really doesn't hide, like actually makes you see the puck better, like an example for people that are baseball fan, the batter's eye. So, like, there's no depth perception there, where I think that factored in, where he probably could have made maybe one of those saves, 2 of them in a stadium setting like Nick got at, but there was no depth, and then you made it worse by putting 2 defensemen at forward. So I don't know what the whole logistics was behind that reasoning, but it wasn't a good one. So I think going into that game, I didn't think we were going to win it in the first place. And once we did that lineup, I really did not think we were honestly going to win that game. So I didn't really expect to win. I just went into that game going, let me just enjoy the setting of Lake Tahoe and come out of this going, this was all for TV fare, obviously, and the setting was cool. The 9-hour delay in the first game was not, but the setting itself was cool. So I think that's just what I took out of it. There's no point at bitching about the play because I didn't expect them to do anything in that game, honestly. I thought we were going to lose that game. Boston's a far better team usually against us matchup-wise in the last 10 years, and without everybody in the lineup, it just logistically and factually makes sense that they were going to beat them.
Yeah, so it certainly hurt their lack of depth. But they're slated to potentially get 2 guys back for tomorrow night's game. Actually, it'll be tonight by the time this episode is released, against the New York Rangers. And it's a one home game before they hit the road for 5 consecutive, 2 up in Buffalo, 2 up in Pittsburgh, 1 up in Boston. But yeah, home against the Rangers, they could potentially get Claude Giroux back as well as Justin Braun. Of course, that's pending how these guys are feeling. Now, they tested positive for COVID back on February 9th, and today's the 23rd. So today marks the 2 weeks that are necessary for them to be quarantined. And so that is why they could potentially be back in the lineup tomorrow night. Of course, as I said, that depends on how they're feeling, and it depends on, if they feel like they're ready to go. If they are back in the lineup, or how much of a boost is that for the Flyers going up against New York tomorrow night?
Well, G at this point of his career is obviously more of the leader chip-in guy, but having him on the ice really helps in terms of the mentality and the leadership group of the team. In terms of Braun, Braun is really just, he thinks the game well, but can't get to the spots just because of his speed ability at this point of his career. So I don't know. Like, obviously, a sixth defenseman doesn't make or break your team. So I think, now, Gus might, but most sixth defensemen don't. Where you actually are able to figure that one out. Where I think that'll get solved by something we'll probably get into after this, which is picking someone up. If we need to do that, I think they'll let it go for a bit because we haven't had the full roster at all this season. But once you see how it is with the full roster, I think that's when they're determined in a week or some change what the team actually is and what they want to have the makings of the team be, or if they want to just roll with it and see what happens. But I mean, I just see this team needing to definitely improve in terms of, one, helping their goaltender in terms of the bottom D group, because our bottom D group, no matter who you put anybody with, has usually been one of the worst graded groups. Hag with Braun is bottom 3 in the league. When you look at defensive grades, Hag with Gus is around the same. I think it's like bottom 10. So, like, all those guys, that doesn't make or break your team, but it certainly does not help your team having your third defensive pair usually just kind of suck when you look at the actual numbers. So that's something they really need to improve on. But the sense that you get, and Jim Jackson brought this up too, when we get all the media stuff, is forward defense. It seems like the coaching staff is pretty pissed off with how the forwards are playing defense this year, where they're producing offensively, but that doesn't matter if you suck on the defensive end, because usually in the hindsight of things, usually what tends to win a game and a close game in the end is not you out scoring the team. It's usually you being able to hold the lead in the end, where the Flyers have not been very good at doing that this far. So they have to figure that out. Otherwise, I do not think you're going to be able to get as far as you want to go. I think you'll go farther this year, but you'll probably meet Tampa or somebody like that, and then you're not going to, or Boston again, and you won't be able to get past there, where you have to be able to solidify your overall defensive game to be able to actually have your overall team play the best, where our defense has been spotty at best this year.
Yeah, the defense certainly is an issue that the Flyers need to shore up, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I do think it will help to have Justin Braun at least back in the lineup. At least have him available if they decide to go with him. It certainly adds a little bit of flexibility there. Maybe they can try to mix and match some things to turn a bad defense into a not good but not as bad defense, if that makes any sense. Yeah, but going against the Rangers, though, like we saw the other night, they were at least able to get a point against them. I think that potentially having G back and Braun back should be enough to help them pull out a win there. As I said, the Rangers, not a great team. If you can get those two guys back, I think that should be enough to kind of push them over the edge, at least against the Rangers. But after that, they've got 2 games against Buffalo, and by that point, they should hopefully have a few more guys back. They should have TK back by that point. They should have a few other guys. Should have Jake back by that point as well. Nick, how much do you think it's going to help out to get those guys back right off the bat? Do you think there's going to be kind of like a rust period where they kind of need to get into the swing of things a little bit, or do you think that they'll make an immediate impact?
Well, Ryan, if we're being honest, as Flyers fans, we have to say we have to be a little lenient. We have to. I mean, this is COVID. This isn't like a normal injury kind of thing. This is COVID. It's affected NBA players. When they've gone on the list and had to come back, we saw it with the Sixers, and Seth Curry took him a couple games to get his feet back under him. And especially when you're on skates and trying to go fast, everywhere and every shift. So we have to be a little lenient and understanding that if you're going to get Braun and Giroux back, that's going to be great. It's going to help just having them out there on the ice as bodies, better than what you're throwing out there right now. But, they don't have to necessarily produce to make an impact. Like, it just kind of their physical presence can really help them. And, just having them little by little against the Rangers, and then in the weekend against the Sabres, and then by next week, hopefully get more and more, if not everybody, back for the 3 games against Pittsburgh that was just announced. So kind of just slowly progressing into it little by little. You want to get as many points as you can here, considering where they're at in the standings right now. We'll talk about that in maybe a couple minutes. But, I think just do your business against these 3 games. They're all winnable games, guys, but I think we need to be a little bit understanding as far as COVID goes for when they really get fully healthy.
Yeah, I certainly do agree with that as well. And, it's still early in the season. Yes, they're
Right.
Play double-digit games now, but it's still relatively early. They still got 40-plus games left. A lot of time to right the ship here and get guys healthy and get guys off the COVID list and hopefully not have any more COVID issues from this point on. But Nick, you mentioned the games against Pittsburgh, and I want to get into that real quick. Some of those pending games, those pending reschedules that the Flyers had as of our last recording now have a time and date, and there was one game that was switched at Pittsburgh that was originally scheduled for April 13th, has been moved up to this Saturday, March 6th. That's going to be a 1 p.m. Eastern time puck drop. Also, a few other games were switched around here. A game against Boston that was scheduled for April 5th has been moved to April 10th. The game against Washington that was scheduled for February 9th has been moved to April 13th. That was one of the pending games. Now has a set time for April 13th. Also, the game that was scheduled for Valentine's Day, another one of those games, has now found a time and date of April 22nd. It's a Thursday at 7 p.m. So those are just a few of the games that have been rescheduled for the Flyers. So no more pending dates, at least for now. I'm sure the NHL will have some further shakeups in the schedule, but just an update as to where those games now stand for the Flyers. Every game remaining on the schedule has a scheduled time and date now. Nothing left to be determined there. But getting back to the Flyers, their issues. We mentioned the COVID stuff. We mentioned their lack of depth over the last few games. But one thing that has been consistent over the course of the season, even when they were healthy, the defense has been shit. The defense has been some of the guys have played well, but by and large has been pretty bad. Carter Hart not getting any help. He hasn't really helped himself, but he hasn't had a whole lot of help in front of him either. And Nick, do you have any ideas to what the Flyers may be able to do to kind of shore that up and at least make the defense passable for the rest of the season?
Rob, it is so tough because we're gonna rip to shreds how bad Gus has been, but other than that,
it's good to know that you agree with Boric and our other host Steve and I. We've all been on board with that opinion that Gus has been fucking trash.
See, what sucks, Rob, is this has kind of been a situation where with the COVID and everything out, you would hope to bring players in from the taxi squad or the Phantoms or whatever that you could fill in and, feel confident about. But that is exactly what happened, except the opposite. They had guys fill in that they thought would be good fill-in role players for the occasional game or two if something were to happen, and it just fell flat on its face. Let's be honest. Gus really only had maybe, 2-3 good games, and I'm just being, off the top of my head, just generous there.
You're being very generous there.
Yeah, other than that, guys, I don't know as far as who they can bring in internally. You guys would know probably more than me, other than what we just saw. But other than that, I don't know, because clearly their best lineup, or I guess the best lineup they had put out so far this season, couldn't beat Boston. That's your best team. And when you can't beat the top seed in the East, that shows you have a lot of work to do defensively. And we mentioned the blown leads they've had in those couple games against Boston earlier this season. So I don't know what else they can do at this point. Borg, if you have anything more insider information than I do.
Defense in terms of young guys, Zamula ain't ready and not really. I don't think he'll be ready this year. He's raw. He shows greatness, and then he shows the ability that you see he has to still hone stuff in. So I don't think he will be an answer yet. Obviously, Cam York is still occupied. Until that's the case, he can't be an answer. But in terms of veterans, I mean, if you want to go, the one game he played, he actually looked decent. You could see if Prosser fills in all right again.
Yeah, he goes out and he scores a goal and he
Yeah.
plays good defense and they don't play him again.
Yeah, I would say I
Yeah.
would put him in again. I don't really think Derek Pouliot's much, but I mean, he has that NHL experience. Wilderspoon's had NHL experience. Bydris, those guys have all had NHL experience, but they're more like play them 5 to 15 games at most, and you're be all right. You don't want to overplay those guys, otherwise you're going to start seeing the effects of it. But those are the guys with NHL experience. I think the guy that you put on waivers is the guy that honestly probably had the best chance of doing something, since he was more kind of in his head last year, where this year I think he's been playing out of his head a little bit in Friedman until they put him at forward, where for some reason he played his best game of the season. That was one of the only people that I didn't get pissed at Tahoe. So I don't know why we put him on waivers. Like, I haven't really questioned since AV came in a lot of moves, but the last 5 days I'm kind of just like, what the fuck? Like I don't understand half of the shit we're doing. Like, Friedman shouldn't have played the wing. Regardless, he played half decent, especially for not playing since he was 9 freaking years old. But Morin needs to move back to defense. I think that could be your answer, because first of all, a guy in what Samuel Morin was supposed to be, if he can kind of become that, and he played a game on defense with the Phantoms this year, if he can just become the brute shot blocker that really pisses off the other team and gets physical, I think he has a better chance to do that on defense than forward. He could actually maybe be the saving grace on the third line with Gus, because all he does is stays back when he plays defense. He doesn't really move up on the play, where obviously Gus is a freaking loose cannon. So usually in Chicago, they had him with someone that obviously was not 6'7", but would just stay back and play defense at times. Like when Seabrook was healthy, sometimes it would be him. So I think him, if he can become that and move back to defense, that could work until Zamula is actually ready, but you're not going to have Gus by then, where maybe he would then pair with a Ghost if you still have Ghost, because he can kind of stay back and provide on the play, but is very good at staying back. He's just very raw, where that would be my observation on that. The guy you put on waivers is probably the guy you shouldn't have put on waivers, but it is what it is, and hopefully he clears waivers, otherwise you're down another depth defenseman. So that's the way it is. I think it's more you just have to have these guys figure it out, honestly, at this point. And Gus is probably going to start getting benched, and you're going to see different guys so they can try to figure it out in the Prossers of the world. Maybe even Pouliot, who's been on the taxi squad a couple of times, and other guys. I think you'll see them kind of go in and out of the lineup, because if Gus doesn't improve, I don't see why you would keep him in there.
Yeah, Gus has one redeeming quality, and that's quarterbacking the second unit of the power play. He's got 7 points on the season. I believe, if I'm correct, 5 of them have come on the power play.
Yep.
So
5.
really, outside of that man advantage being on that second unit, he's literally done nothing for them. He's done nothing good offensively at even strength. He hasn't done anything well defensively all season long. So he's really just a waste of space out there on the ice.
Now, one good point that Jim Jackson did make about Gus, though, is no one makes themselves available on our team. Where if you watch Chicago, the main reason they're a surprise team of this year is for all their young defensemen, you have about all three of their forwards going, me. Like, where all the Flyers are like in Tampa Bay when they're in Philadelphia, all the way up the ice. Like, there's nowhere near the play on the other end, unless if it's Sean Couturier and Fairby, who some usually make themselves available, where everyone else for some reason is at the other blue line. So that also doesn't help your defense be able to move the puck up the ice, because Gus he'll make a pass if it's open, but he'll also make a pass if it's not open. So you should make yourself available, and that might also in long run help a guy like him out, where our forwards are pretty damn bad this season and making themselves available in the neutral zone for our defensemen. For some reason, they go like right at the blue line, and that's just the stupidest strategy. So that's something they got to figure out too, and tell their forwards to come back more and make themselves available, where nobody's listening to that, obviously, for some reason.
Yeah, and we've seen that kind of hurt Gus on a number of occasions, where he's just really struggling to even just get the puck out of the zone. That's one of the biggest drawbacks with him, is his failed clears, his turnovers in deep that have led to opposing scoring opportunities. So it's something that definitely needs to be worked out. That is for certain. And I'm with you. I think that there is going to come a point where he's getting benched, where he's not out there playing because just his defensive liability has become too much of an issue. It already is too much of an issue, but there's going to come a point where AVs, you know, can't deal with this anymore. They've got to get someone who's a little bit more solid defensively. I'm praying that Friedman clears waivers, although I'm not confident. I feel like there's definitely going to be a team out there that's smart enough to pick him up, but praying that he can clear waivers and the Flyers will get lucky. They're able to bring him back, and I think that he could be that guy who's a little bit more, I guess, a little bit more mature defensively. He doesn't always feel the need to go up and join the rush and be an offensive defenseman. He can just be the stay-at-home defensive guy who can provide some stability there. But once again, we need him to clear waivers, and that was a very, very questionable decision to put him out there on waivers. But yeah, this team in dire need of defensive help. They want to go anywhere in the playoffs this year, especially after what we've seen in the first 5 games that they played against Boston, where the Bruins have just taken complete advantage of every single mistake the Flyers have made, whether it be being out of position defensively or taking bad penalties. Everything bad that the Flyers have done, Boston has jumped all over it. So certainly need to shore up those defensive deficiencies. And I want to move on now to another thing that's been a downfall of the Flyers this season, and it's something that nobody ever thought would be a downfall. It's the goaltending. Carter Hart, you can call it a sophomore slump, but really, I mean, he's been bad. He's been up and down. He's had a few games where he's been pretty decent here and there, but by and large, just letting in a lot of goals he wouldn't normally let in. I talked about it earlier. He's not cutting down the angle like he did last season. He's allowing guys to pick corners on him, which is something that never happened last year. Maybe it's a result of, the defense being bad and he feels the need to overcompensate. But guys, and Borg, I'll start with you. What do you make of the situation with him? Do you think it's just a small blip on the radar that he'll be able to overcome? Or do you think maybe they should look to giving Brian Elliott a few more starts and kind of going with, I guess, more of a 1A, 1B situation as opposed to 1 and 2 situation?
I mean, if you want to give him a mental rest, I don't think it would be a bad idea giving Moose a couple games, but I think it's a blip on the radar where I was a little bit more concerned until I listened to Jim Jackson, which obviously has one of the best inside pulses on the team, where he made a very good point of goaltenders more than defensemen, which is obviously a very routine-based position, probably more so than the forwards, where you can get away with just having skill and figuring it out when you haven't practiced for 14 days. Where goaltenders need to see pucks. If you're just sitting on your couch drinking martinis and wine all day, that's not getting you anywhere. When you have to just kind of chill and only can practice in your backyard or go wherever to practice when you're not really, the facilities aren't open. So I think that really played in. And also this year teams haven't had normal practices all the time because of the protocols. It's not all the same exact joyful practices that teams would have with like messing with each other to kind of help the team morale. So I think all that put together goes into it a bit. I just think Hart is a guy that's very position-based in his position. His ticker looks a little bit off, where I did read he's trying to change his style a little bit so he doesn't commit early or something like that, where if you're trying to change your style, it's kind of like a pitcher trying to change his movement, like how he pitches and his and all that, where we saw that with Roy Halladay, the Hall of Famer, obviously, where he had to change. He changed it in Toronto, and it took him a while. Where if you change something up, it does take a bit. Where if that's the case, then that's probably why he changed up his technique a bit, where he doesn't want to be more vulnerable to stuff. But in learning that technique, he is vulnerable right now. So it'll probably get going in a couple weeks. It also would help if the forwards again could actually help the defenseman more, and the defense could play more consistent in itself. But that kind of both goes together. The defense would play a lot better if forwards, for some reason, were not on the other side of the damn ice every time the defenseman got the puck. So that all needs to go together in order to get the goaltender to play better and the team as a whole to play better. And the only reason, I mean, Moose has just been ridiculous this year, where he's probably playing like he did when he helped St. Louis get on that run to the freaking postseason. Like, that's how good he looked this year, where he's been making saves he probably hasn't made since 5 years ago. So, like, he's been looking probably his best season in the orange and black, honestly, right now. But that's why, for now, I would give him more games, but only to give Hart a mental rest, where I think Hart will come back and be fine. He's always been the one thing you always hear about Hart is the ability to fight through any adversity he's had in his career and still be able to have that good mental strength. That's what's always been touted with Hart. Unlike some other good young goaltenders like Jordan Bennington or somebody like that gets in their head sometimes too much. Matt Murray's another example, obviously. So I think someone like Hart has a better chance of really figuring it out than someone like a Murray who's kind of a hothead, and you kind of see some of the ill effects of that in Ottawa right now. So I think he will be fine in the long run.
Right. So you think just a few days off maybe could be beneficial to Carter Hart, and getting Moose in there for a few games as well, maybe getting, because of the fact that he's played well this year, maybe getting a little bit more stability in the short run by doing that. Nick, what's your takeaway on the situation? What do you think is the deal with Carter Hart this season, and do you think that maybe a little bit of rest could benefit him?
Yeah, let me just hit you guys with some stats real quick. So after the Sunday night game at Tahoe, I was watching post-game live, and Taryn Hatcher really kind of made me think. She gave a really good stat. The Flyers, not facing the Bruins this season, any other team really, are 8-1-1, I believe. So that's a pretty good record against the non-Bruins teams, which is pretty good. And then in Carter's 11 starts this season, he's given up 3 or more goals in 7 of those games, which is really bad. And, I mean, some of them were wins. A lot of them were losses, though, for a mixture of different reasons at that time. So I just don't – I think maybe right now it's a Boston issue with the team overall because they're getting the job done. Before you ran into Boston, as much as we've been playing them recently, and Carter's looked good, even though he's given up a lot of goals recently, they've gotten some wins and stuff like that. But I think some rest. I mean, just looking at the schedule, I think this would be a good time, guys, because you don't have everyone back right now, and then turn the calendar to next month. Things are going to a little pick up again. So maybe you start Elliott Wednesday night in. Against the Rangers, and then maybe again against Buffalo, but then Sunday you play Carter again, or Saturday, vice versa. It doesn't matter. And then you turn it over to that 3-game in March, and then maybe they kind of split the games here in March between Carter and Elliott. I don't expect Carter to play all 3, and I don't expect Elliott to play all 3 either, even with that day in between. So, I mean, I don't know. Like, he just doesn't look himself, guys. I mean, you watched the bubble last year, and even before the bubble, he was the reason why this team was successful, why they made it really as far as they did against the Islanders at times alone. And the ridiculous times he stood on his head last year was insane, how he just carried this team. And this year, I don't know what the difference. I just can't spot it. Maybe, Brecker, you mentioned the routine. Borg, I'm sorry. You mentioned his stance and the change he's going through right now. So maybe that's part of it. But I don't know. He just doesn't look himself this year. And that, again, has room to grow and change. Now we're still early in the season, but it does cause some concern right now, and you really hope they can get back to rolling and relying on him. He doesn't have to make 40, 50 saves a game. He just got to keep them in the game, because I feel like the offense can win you some games here, and maybe it's a yin and yang thing. The offense got to carry some games, and Carter can carry some games too, and in the long run, mentally, Carter maybe can take a step back even this week or this weekend even, and kind of watch the game. Because, they say when you watch a game from the bench and you get a different vantage point, you clear your mind. You can do this in the NFL as well. When you're benched or something, we saw this with Carson Wentz. It messed him up this year when he was benched. But maybe from a goalie's perspective, just take a step back for a couple games and just kind of reset yourself a little bit. get some players back and kind of get on routine again where you can get some wins together and some big games coming up here.
Yeah, and you know what? Sometimes it's beneficial for these young goaltenders to sit on the bench for a little bit and kind of view things from that perspective. We saw it, I guess, in an extended way with a couple guys. Tuukka Rask spent a couple years. Well, he had the starting gig back in 2010, obviously, when the Flyers had the big comeback against the Bruins, but then he lost that for a few years to Tim Thomas. He spent a few years sitting on that bench, taking things in from a backup perspective. Also, Carey Price burst onto the scene with Montreal in 2008, and then Jaro Halak took over for about a year or so, and Carey Price spent a couple years looking at things from the backup perspective. Now, I'm not saying give Carter Hart a couple years as a backup. I don't think that's feasible. I think you want him to be the starter, but just in the short term, giving him a few games here and there, sitting on that bench, taking things in from that backup perspective, I think could really go a long way for a young goaltender like him. So, yeah, I think that giving him a few days off, getting Moose in the net, getting him some reps between the pipes could be beneficial for the team, not just for Hart, getting that perspective as a backup, but also for Moose, keeping him fresh as well. So that's a move I think that the Flyers are likely to make. I think Moose will be the guy between the pipes tomorrow night or tonight by the time this podcast is released. I wouldn't be surprised to see him go probably the first game of the Buffalo series as well. So they definitely need better goaltending out of Carter Hart, and I think if they play their cards right, they could put him in a position to succeed and be a better goalie as the season goes along. You guys have any final thoughts before we wrap up this episode here?
Well, mine I was just going to say on the goaltenders was I feel like that's why I don't love the taxi squad rules for goaltenders, because of what we talked about routine, and the goalies that are on the taxi squad do absolutely nothing other than practice. So, there's no routine there from in-game perspective, where I felt like they could have done something with that rule where if you're on the taxi squad, you can still say play a certain amount of AHL games or something like that, because with goaltenders especially, you need to have seen pucks. Like, you can't, it's like a pitcher in baseball. You can't just sit them down for 2 months and say, okay, you're now subbing in as the third starter. Like, that's not going to work. So I feel like that is something I always thought was a stupid way that they're doing that, where there should be a way to actually get them in action, where some teams have done it. Some teams have tried to have figured out a way to get their third goalie in action, but then that ends up hurting your team because you have to put your third string goaltender in so he actually gets reps. So I feel like the NHL should have figured out a better strategy with that. That's the one thing they kind of shit the bed on when it came to the quarantine rules, but it is what it is, because teams have had goalie injuries, and you see the guys come in from the taxi squad, and it takes them about 3 games before they're in a groove because they've seen no game action in like 365 days. So I think that's something that they screwed up on, but it's something they could fix in season 2, and I think they should.
Yeah, I certainly do agree with that, and that's an interesting thing to bring up there. Honestly, I didn't even think about that, but yeah, just sitting around for basically the whole season, it's really not beneficial there. So yeah, that's a good point you brought up there. Nick, you got anything you want to throw in here?
Yeah, as far as final thoughts, Rob, I think offensively, again, guys, we've seen a little bit of some good diverse scoring so far this year. I would like some other guys to step up. Knack, Raffle, G's had a lot of assists, but he isn't getting on the score sheet. You're getting guys like Farabee and JVR are doing, I think, their job much more than I predicted this season that they would as far as to this point. I'm not, again, too worried about the offense overall. I think they will get better with said time, and they are putting points up. That's a good thing. They're staying in a lot of these games, and they probably could win a couple more. They could have won a couple more. And then just the goalie thing to wrap up. Just learning Carter learning from Elliott could be beneficial to him again, and just taking that step back that he might need just for a couple games, and listen to Elliott and what he has to say to input, and hopefully just kind of get better each day, watch the film, and just learn. That's all you can do is just learn to get better. We're not expecting him to be perfect every night. We can't. We just need him to keep us in games, not give up, more than 3 goals a game, and we could just win games that way.
Yeah, and make the saves that he should be making as well.
Yeah.
And I also want to talk about that scoring depth that you alluded to. I'm really looking for, when they come back, Lindy and TK being a little bit more productive offensively than they have been so far this season. We talked about it in previous shows. Lindy obviously coming back from the cancer. That's no small task. So you can understand why he's maybe been a little bit slow in the offensive end so far. But, we're talking about a guy who, when he went out last season, was the leading goal scorer for this team. And we want to see him get back to that, obviously. And TK had the hat trick early on in the season against the Penguins and really hasn't produced a whole lot, or hadn't produced a whole lot up until going on the COVID list. So when he comes back, I want to see him get back to the TK that he was, who led the team in points last season. And if you can get your leading point scorer firing on all cylinders, I think that's a big thing as well. They've performed well as a team offensively, but I still feel like there's a few guys there who have a little bit of room left to improve. So once they can get those guys going, I think they should be in some pretty good shape there. Lastly, I just want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Just Food. They're located in Buckingham Green, Buckingham, Pennsylvania. You can reach them by phone at 215-794-FOOD. That's 215-794-3663. An excellent selection of food there. Their owner, Asian Rob, a great friend of the Always Next to Your podcast network. Once again, Just Food in Buckingham, PA, Buckingham Green. You can reach them by phone at 215-794-3663. We thank you again, Nick, for joining us tonight. And where again can we find you and your podcast on Twitter?
It's 215 Unfiltered Network, I believe, on Twitter. So check that out. Yeah, 215 Podcast Network on Twitter, over 1,000 followers. So come join us over there. And then 215 Unfiltered on all podcast platforms. Go over, give a listen, and let us know and support. And it'd be really, really appreciated.
Yeah, definitely go do that. Great podcast to listen to. Thanks again, Nick, for joining us tonight. And thanks, Boric, as always, for being a part of this show. And thank you all for listening to us. And we'll be back with another episode next week.
I used to be revered and feared through Killarney. Now I'm back to hitching with the wind. But if Mickey Flynn should ever find me, I'll throw me caution all behind me and square off on that son of a bitch again. He cracked open a river too, he beat me Sunday through and through, and so jig over my unconscious frame. I won me healthy sheriff fights, well lucky son still had me life since Mickey Flynn beat me dumb and lame.